It is hard to believe that the man I hated most for more than half my life was also the man I owed the most. William, at last, you are here. I spent so many years fighting you. I wanted to defeat you. I wanted to see you lose everything you had. We stood on opposite sides for so long that I almost forgot something very important. Before we became enemies, we were complete strangers. And now I am standing here in front of your grave. Looking down at your name, I realize something I spent most of my life refusing to admit. Perhaps the man I hated most was also the man who helped shape the life I would eventually have. Rest in peace, my friend. But if you want to understand how two men could spend a lifetime fighting each other, then you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to go back to a forest whose name I did not even know. That was where I first cried. April 18th, 1906. Slonim, Poland. I do not remember that day. How could I? I was only a newborn child. But the story was told to me many times. A young hunter came across a woman who had died after giving birth to a child. That child was me. The boy did not know what to do with a newborn baby left alone in the forest, but somehow he decided to take me home. His family already had 8 mouths to feed. My arrival meant that everyone would have a little less. His father was the first to reject me. But Helena was different. So was her eldest daughter, Florentina. They looked at me and decided that I should stay. Helena believed that God had brought me to her. And so she made the decision that would change my entire life. She raised me. They gave me the name Władek Koskiewicz. I grew up in a family of hunters. We had little money and there was no tradition of education in our home. Most of our lives revolved around hunting and trapping. But I had Florentina. She was the one person I followed everywhere. When she had to leave home to attend school, I followed her. And that was when I discovered another world. School. For the first time, I was treated almost like an adult. Instead of spending my time doing physical work at home, I began reading. I studied. And I discovered that I loved learning. Before long, I was at the top of my class. I still did not know who I really was. I did not know where I had come from. But I was beginning to understand that perhaps my life did not have to remain the life I had been born into. And while I was growing up in a poor hunter's family in Poland, another boy was growing up on the other side of the Atlantic. His name was William Lowell Kane. He was born on the very same day as I was. But that was where the similarities ended. I was found in a forest with no known parents. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts, into one of the wealthiest families in America. His father, Richard, had built a fortune worth millions. William was destined to inherit it. He was expected to become a banker. He was raised in a world of wealth, education, and privilege. I had almost nothing. He was born with almost everything. I was still trying to discover who I was. He was already carrying a name that opened doors. At the time, I knew nothing about William Kane, and he knew nothing about me. We were 2 children, born on the same day, growing up in 2 completely different worlds. Neither of us could have known that our paths would one day cross. Neither of us could have imagined what that meeting would cost us. But before William Kane became my greatest rival, I was simply a boy named Władek, a boy who had been found crying in a forest, and a boy who had no idea what fate had planned for him. In a family of hunters, we had very little money, and there was no great tradition of education in our home. Most of the men knew how to hunt and trap animals. That was the life I was expected to live. Florentina was different. She was the eldest daughter, and she was the one person I followed everywhere. I was always beside her, watching what she did, listening to what she said. So when she had to leave home to attend school, I could not bear the thought of being separated from her. I followed her, and that decision changed my life. For the first time, I walked into a school. I still remember how strange it felt. The teacher treated me almost like an adult. There were books everywhere. There were questions I had never thought to ask, and answers I had never known existed. I became fascinated by learning. When I returned home, I no longer wanted to spend my time doing physical work. I wanted to read. I wanted to study. I wanted to understand the world beyond the small life I had known. Before long, I was at the top of my class. I was still poor. I still did not know who my real parents were. But for the first time, I began to believe that perhaps my circumstances did not have to determine my future. Then, one autumn evening in 1911, a man arrived at our door. His name was Baron Rosnovski. He had come for me. The Baron had a son named Leon. Leon was being educated at home, and although he was intelligent, the Baron believed he needed someone who could challenge him. Teacher in the province had told him that I might be that boy. The Baron offered to take me to his castle. I agreed. But I had one condition. Florentina had to come with me. She was 14 years old by then, and I knew she could work at the castle. More importantly, I simply did not want to leave her behind. The Baron accepted. And so, for the first time in my life, I entered a world I had only ever imagined. A castle. Everything was different. The rooms were enormous. The food was plentiful. The people dressed in ways I had never seen before. And then I met Leon. He was intelligent, but he was lonely. At first, there was a considerable difference between us. He had been educated from an early age. I had not, but I had something else. I was hungry to learn. We studied together, we played together, and before long, we began competing with each other. Every time Leon moved ahead, I worked harder. Every time I learned something new, I wanted to learn something else. Slowly, I began to close the gap between us. The Baron was pleased. He had wanted a rival for his son. Instead, he found something more. He began to treat me like one of his own family. For a boy like me, that meant more than I could possibly explain. But whenever the holidays came, I had to return to the hunter's home. And each time I returned, I felt more uncomfortable. The food was poor. The environment was harsh. The people around me did not understand why I cared so much about books and learning. I had begun to change. And eventually, I discovered something that changed the way I looked at that family forever. I learned that I was not their biological son. Strangely enough, I did not feel the sadness I might have expected. By then, I already knew where I wanted to belong. I wanted to stay at the Baron's castle. So I asked for permission to remain there during the holidays. And from that moment on, the castle became more than a place where I studied. It became my home. I did not know it then, but the man who had opened that door for me would become one of the most important people in my life. And while my childhood was taking me toward a completely different future, William Kane was growing up in Boston. He was being given the finest education his family could provide. He was intelligent, disciplined, and determined to live up to the Kane name. But neither of us knew what was coming, because in June 1914, an assassination in Sarajevo would set Europe on fire. And when the First World War began, the peaceful life I had finally found at the castle would not survive for long. I thought I had finally found a place where I belonged. Castle had become my home. Leon had become my friend and rival. The Baron had begun to treat me like one of his own. Then, in June 1914, an assassination in Sarajevo set Europe on fire. The First World War had begun. From that moment on, the Baron changed. He became quieter, more distant. He seemed to understand that the world around us was beginning to fall apart. And then, in August 1915, he decided to move everyone from the castle toward the north. It did not save us. German soldiers eventually reached the castle. They captured the people who worked there and took us prisoner. Florentina, the Baron, 24 servants, and I were locked inside the basement of the castle. I remember the darkness. I remember the fear. More than anything, I remember watching the Baron. He had lost his son, Leon. And after that, something inside him seemed to disappear. He became silent. His eyes became cold. He was surrounded by soldiers, yet somehow he seemed more distant from them than ever. Then one day, he saw me changing clothes. And he noticed something that I had never understood about myself. The strange mark on my body. The Baron had seen it before. But this time, something in his expression changed. From that moment on, he began spending what little time we had left together teaching me. History, geography, languages, mathematics. He taught me everything he could. I did not understand why he was suddenly so determined to prepare me. But now, looking back, I know he already understood something that I did not. He knew he was dying. By the autumn of 1918, the Baron could no longer hide it. He called his 2 butlers and made his final wishes known. He wanted to leave everything he owned to me. His property, his possessions, and the ring he wore. I was still only a boy. Yet this man, who had once been a stranger to me, was preparing to leave me everything he had. Not because I was his son, not because I belonged to his family by name, but because in some way he had chosen me. Then he died. By the time they buried him, I had discovered something that made his final gift even more difficult to understand. The Baron had the same physical condition I had. Only then did I begin to wonder whether there was a connection between us that I had never known. But I had no time to find the answer. The war was still raging, and the world around us was becoming more dangerous every day. Then the Russian army attacked the castle. The German soldiers were forced to retreat. For a brief moment, I thought it meant freedom. I was wrong. The soldiers took everyone out of the basement and brought us to a lake. Florentina was there. She was 20 years old. And what happened next became one of the memories I would carry for the rest of my life. I tried to protect her. I could not. I was only a boy. There were too many soldiers. When it was over, Florentina was gone. My sister, person who had followed me into a new world when I was a child, person who had always made me feel that I belonged somewhere. Gone. I buried her beside Leon and the Baron, 3 people who had been my family. Three graves standing together, and I was left alone. That was the moment my childhood ended. I had entered the castle as a poor boy who wanted an education. I left it carrying the memory of everyone I had lost. And from that day forward, I no longer believed that the world would give me anything. If I wanted something, I would have to take it for myself. While my world was being destroyed in Poland, William Kane was growing up in Boston. He had lost his father years earlier, when Richard died aboard the Titanic. But unlike me, William inherited something from that loss. And responsibility, wealth, a name. His family taught him the value of money from an early age. He received $1 a week, but he had to record every cent he spent. Half went toward investment, 20% toward spending, 10% toward charity, and 20% was kept in reserve. William learned to manage money before most children even understood what money could do. By the age of 9, he had saved enough to buy himself a bicycle and still had money left over. He even began investing. I was learning how to survive. He was learning how to build a fortune. We were still living in two completely different worlds. But the distance between those worlds was slowly becoming smaller. Because while I was preparing to leave Poland, William was preparing to enter the world of business. And neither of us knew that one day the lives we were building separately would collide. By the time I reached America, I had already lost almost everything. My childhood was gone. The Baron was gone. Florentina was gone. And the world I had known in Poland no longer existed. But I was still alive. That was enough. I had learned something during the war. If I wanted to survive, I could not wait for someone to save me. I had to save myself. America was supposed to be a new beginning. Instead, it became another battlefield. I arrived with almost nothing, but I carried everything the Baron had taught me. His lessons, his determination, and his belief that a man could change his own destiny. I found work. I watched people. I learned how business worked. Every experience taught me something. Every setback made me more determined. I had spent my childhood trying to escape poverty. Now I wanted something more than survival. I wanted to build something of my own. And that was when I began moving toward the hotel business. I did not know it yet, but this decision would eventually put me directly in the path of William Kane. While I was trying to build my future in America, William was building his own. He had entered the world of banking. Kane's name had opened doors for him, but William did not simply depend on his inheritance. He was intelligent, disciplined, and ambitious. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to build something that belonged to him. And that ambition would eventually bring him to the same place I was heading. Two men, two completely different beginnings, and one city that would eventually bring us together. I remember the first time I heard the name Kane. At first it meant nothing to me. Just another powerful American family. Another name belonging to a world I had only recently entered. But then I learned more. William Kane was not simply a wealthy man. He was becoming one of the most influential bankers in the country. And slowly, without either of us realizing it, our businesses began moving toward the same battlefield. I was building hotels. He was building a banking empire. I wanted to create something that could stand on its own. He wanted to protect the Kane legacy. At that point, I still had no reason to hate him. I had never met him. He had never harmed me. In fact, if you had told me then that one day I would stand beside his grave and call him my friend, I would have thought you were insane. But fate has a strange sense of humor. The man who would eventually become my greatest enemy was already moving toward me, and I was moving toward him. And neither of us knew it. Not yet. But our lives were about to collide. And when they did, it would not be a brief encounter. It would become a war that would last for decades. When I arrived in America, I knew that I needed a new beginning. I had survived the war. I had lost the people who had been my family. Now I was standing on the other side of the Atlantic, carrying little more than my memories and everything the Baron had taught me. On the journey to America, I met a Polish man named Jor. Through him, I also met Xavier. The three of us eventually made it to America. And somewhere along that journey, I made another decision. I would no longer live as Władek Koskiewicz. I chose a new name, Abel Rosnovski. It was more than just a name. It was the beginning of another life. When I reached New York, I found work as a waiter at the Plaza Hotel. My days were spent serving wealthy people, but I was not only watching their tables, I was watching them. I listened to their conversations. I listened to them talk about business, money, and investments. And every night after work, I went to Columbia University to improve my English. I studied reading and writing. I studied economics. I wanted to understand the world these wealthy men lived in. I had spent my childhood watching poverty. Now I wanted to understand wealth. After 3 years at the Plaza, I had worked my way into serving some of the wealthiest men in the city. That gave me something more valuable than money. It gave me information. I began using what I heard to invest in the stock market. And slowly, I started making money. For the first time, I could see that the lessons I had learned as a poor boy could actually change my life. I was no longer simply trying to survive. I was beginning to build something. In 1926, I became an American citizen. By then, I had already caught the attention of a man named Davis Leroy. He owned 11 Richmond hotels. Davis had been watching me carefully. He saw something in me that I did not yet fully recognize myself. He offered me a position as assistant manager at his hotel in Chicago. I studied Davis. I studied his hotel chain. And eventually, I accepted. I left the Plaza and moved to Chicago. But when I arrived at the Richmond Hotel, I discovered that the place was in terrible condition. The hotel was run badly. The manager was lazy. Many of the employees could barely speak English. And the hotel was operating at less than 40% of its capacity. I looked around and thought about everything I had learned. This was not simply a failing hotel. It was an opportunity. I had spent years watching successful people. Now I finally had a chance to see whether I could become one of them. So I began to work. I studied the operation, watched the employees. I looked for the problems nobody else wanted to see. And slowly, I began to change the hotel. At the same time, another young man was moving toward his own future. His name was William Kane. In the autumn of 1924, he entered Harvard with his friend Matthew. While I was learning how to rebuild a failing hotel, he was learning how to build a future in banking. He focused on his studies. Then he began working as a trainee at Leicester Bank. On April 18, 1927, William turned 21. And with that birthday came something I could barely imagine at my age. He officially inherited his father's fortune. He had wealth. He had a powerful family name. And he had a place waiting for him in the world of banking. By June 1928, he graduated from Harvard. He continued working at Leicester Bank before eventually joining the family bank, Kane and Abel. The people running the bank wanted him back. And in 1928, at only 22 years old, William became the director responsible for investments. I was building hotels. He was building a banking career. I had created myself from nothing. He had inherited a fortune and was learning how to protect it. We were still moving in completely different directions. But the distance between us was getting smaller. Neither of us knew it yet. Soon, our paths would finally cross. For 3 months, I studied the Richmond Hotel in Chicago. The longer I stayed there, the more problems I found. The hotel looked respectable from the outside, but behind the doors it was falling apart. The previous manager had allowed a small group of employees to build a system for stealing money from the hotel. The scheme was simple. If 10 guests checked in, the front desk would record only 8. The money from the other 2 guests would disappear. Food and other services were handled in much the same way. Even guests who stayed for only 1 night could simply disappear from the hotel's records. I watched. I listened. And I quietly discovered who was involved. Then I went to Davis. I told him the hotel needed to be reorganized from the ground up. But Davis was distracted. His attention was on the stock market. He had spent years investing, and he had become far more interested in his investments than in the hotels that had made his fortune. Eventually, however, Davis gave me the authority I needed. He promoted me to manager, and he gave me the power to dismiss anyone who was hurting the hotel. I did not hesitate. I removed the corrupt manager. I dismissed the employees involved in stealing from the guests. Then I began rebuilding the hotel. I reorganized the operation. I improved the decoration. I upgraded the kitchen. I changed the way the hotel was being run. I knew that if I wanted to succeed, I could not simply manage the problems I had inherited. I had to rebuild the entire system. 6 months after I became manager, something happened that meant more to me than any title. The Richmond Hotel made a profit for the first time since it had been established. That was the moment I knew I could do this. I could take something that was failing and make it work. At the same time, I continued investing in the stock market. When I had left the plaza, I had about $8,000. 18 months later, that account had grown to $30,000. For the first time, I was not merely working for money. My money was beginning to work for me. Then another opportunity appeared. Davis's sister, Amy, owned 25% of the Richmond chain. She wanted cash. I bought her 25% stake for $40,000. Suddenly, I was no longer just the manager. I was a part owner of the hotel business. I had come to America with almost nothing. Now I was building something that belonged to me. And then there was Melanie, Davis's daughter. From the first time I met her, I was fascinated by her. I knew there was a world between us. I was an immigrant. I had arrived in America with nothing. And to many people, I was not good enough for a woman like Melanie. But I did not care. I had spent my entire life being told what I could not have. I had learned not to listen. So I began courting her. For a while, everything seemed to be going my way. The hotels were growing. My investments were growing. My position was growing. And I began to believe that perhaps I had finally escaped the life I was born into. Then September 1929 arrived. The stock market crashed. The world I thought was becoming more secure suddenly became uncertain again. The number of guests at the hotels dropped sharply. I had to dismiss a large number of employees simply to keep the business alive. The real disaster was not the hotel. It was Davis. One night he asked me to have a drink with him. That night he finally told me the truth. The Richmond hotels had originally been built with money he had inherited. Years earlier, he had mortgaged the hotels and borrowed $2 million from the bank. He had invested that money in the stock market. For a while, it had worked. His fortune had grown to $5 million. And because of that success, he had stopped paying attention to the hotels. But when the market collapsed, everything changed. He tried to sell his shares. It was too late. The fortune he thought he had built was suddenly worth almost nothing. The bank knew Davis could no longer repay his debt, so they took control of the Richmond hotels, and they wanted to sell them as quickly as possible. Davis went to the bank and tried to convince the investment director to give him more time. He introduced them to me. He told them that the hotel business was improving. He believed that if the bank stayed with us through the crisis, it could eventually make money. But the bank refused. Davis had reached the end of the road. I did not know it yet. That night would change my life again, and it would lead me directly to the man whose name I had only recently begun to hear. William Kane. That night, Davis and I drank together. He had been carrying the weight of his failure for a long time, and finally, he told me everything. The Richmond hotels were no longer truly his. Years earlier, he had mortgaged them to the bank for $2 million. He had taken that money and invested it in the stock market. For years, the gamble had worked. His fortune had grown to $5 million. But then the market collapsed. The money disappeared. The shares he had once believed were his fortune were now almost worthless. And the bank knew it. They were ready to take the hotels and sell them. I could see what this meant for Davis. He had spent his life building the Richmond chain. Now, in the space of a few months, he was watching everything disappear. I tried to convince him that we could still save the hotels. But Davis had already lost hope. The next morning, he wrote 3 letters. One to his daughter, one to his lawyer, and one to me. Then he made the decision to end his life by jumping from the 17th floor of the hotel. I still remember the shock of discovering what he had done. Davis was gone, but his final letter had changed everything. He had left me 75% of his share in the company. He wanted me to continue the fight. He wanted me to negotiate with the bank and try to save the hotels. I was devastated by his death, but I was also angry. I believed the bank had pushed him into desperation, and I wanted someone to pay for it. On January 4th, 1930, I walked into the offices of Kane and Abel. For the first time, I came face to face with the man whose name I had heard so many times, William Kane. I looked at him. He looked at me. Neither of us could have known that this meeting would become the beginning of a war that would last for most of our lives. William was calm, professional. He told me that although I now controlled the Richmond hotels, Davis had mortgaged them for $2 million. Legally, the bank owned them. There was nothing I could do. I tried to persuade him. I told him the hotels could become profitable again. I asked him to trust me. If the bank gave us time, I believed we could turn the business around and repay the debt. But William refused. He told me the bank was not in the hotel business. Its responsibility was to recover the money it was owed. He gave me 30 days to find a buyer. If I could not find one, the hotels would be sold at auction. I walked out of that room furious. I had spent my entire life fighting my way upward. I had survived poverty, war, loss. I had crossed an ocean and built a new identity. And now, after everything I had achieved, a banker sitting behind a desk was telling me that the business I had fought to build could simply be taken away. I returned to the hotel, but what I saw when I arrived stopped me cold. The Richmond was on fire. The building was badly damaged. And suddenly, everything I had worked for seemed to be disappearing again. Yet I refused to give up. I had lost too much in my life to surrender now. The police investigated the fire. There were rumors that I had started it myself because I was facing bankruptcy and needed the insurance money. But eventually, they discovered the truth. The fire had been started by someone who wanted revenge against me. I had not burned my own hotel. And if I could prove that, the insurance company would pay. That money might give me one last chance. But I still needed to save the Richmond chain. And I still needed $2 million. Then a man named Mason offered me a job managing his hotel, the Stevens. I told him the truth. I could not simply walk away from Richmond. I needed to solve the problem first. Mason told me to stay at the Stevens for a while. I agreed. And while I was there, something unexpected happened. I met Javier again. 8 years earlier, we had shared a brief memory aboard the Black Arrow. Now, after all those years, our paths crossed again. We became close. And eventually, she would become my wife. Then another surprise arrived. Someone I did not know wanted to invest in me. He offered to pay Davis's $2 million debt and establish a new company with me. He would own 60%. I would own 40%. But the 40% would actually be a loan. If I repaid it, I would have the opportunity to buy the remaining shares and eventually own the entire company. There was only one condition. The investor refused to reveal his identity. He claimed that the investment conflicted with his own business interests. I accepted. I had no idea who was behind the money. I only knew that someone had decided to give me another chance. And with that chance, I could return to Richmond. I could rebuild. I could start again. But somewhere in Boston, William Kane was still fighting his own battles. The economy was collapsing. His bank had suffered enormous losses. And the man who had stood across the desk from me was about to face the greatest challenge of his own career. Neither of us knew it yet. But the next time our paths crossed, we would no longer be strangers. We would be rivals. For the first time in years, I felt that perhaps I had been given another chance. The mysterious investor had agreed to pay Davis $2 million debt. In return, we would establish a new company together. He would own 60%. I would own 40%. Those 40% were not a gift. They were a loan. If I could repay that loan, I would have the opportunity to buy the remaining shares and eventually become the sole owner of Richmond. There was only one thing I did not know. Who was the man behind the money? He refused to reveal his identity. He told me that the investment conflicted with his own business interests, and for that reason, he wanted to remain anonymous. I accepted his conditions. At that moment, I did not care who he was. I had been given a chance to return to Richmond. That was all that mattered. I had lost my childhood. I had lost my family. I had lost Davis. I had nearly lost my business. But somehow, I was still standing, and I was ready to start again. I returned to the hotel business with a completely different mindset. Company needed a new identity. So I changed its name. I called it Baron. The name was a reminder of the man who had once opened the door to a better life for me. The Baron had given me an education. He had given me a home. And now, years after his death, I wanted his name to live on through what I built. The Depression had left thousands of people without work. But I saw something others might have overlooked. There were talented people everywhere. People who had lost their jobs, but not their ability. So I hired them. I brought good people into the company and gave them responsibility. Then I found someone from my past, Jor. We had survived the journey to America together. Now he returned to help me manage the growing hotel business. In 1932, I introduced another idea. I gave each hotel manager much greater responsibility. They would be responsible for their own hotel, and they would receive a share of the profits. I wanted them to think like owners. If the hotel succeeded, they would succeed. I believed that giving people responsibility would make them fight harder for the business. And slowly, Baron began to grow. That same year, Henry came to me representing the insurance company. He brought me the money from the fire at the Chicago hotel, $750,000. It was a huge amount of money, enough to give me the resources I needed to expand. Henry, however, was not simply an insurance representative. He had his own history with William Kane. He had once deceived William's mother out of money. William had eventually thrown him out of the family. Henry had never forgotten it. He hated William, and he knew something else. I did not like William Kane either. At first, that connection meant very little to me. I was focused on building Baron, but Henry and I had found something we shared, a history with the same man. And slowly, that shared resentment would bring us closer. Meanwhile, William Kane was fighting his own battles. The American economy was still struggling. He was trying to protect his bank and find a way through the crisis. In England, however, his friend Tony was doing extremely well. Tony was bringing enormous profits to Leicester Bank. By the end of 1932, he returned to Boston with ambitions of his own. He wanted the presidency of Kane and Cabot. And in January 1934, the board would have to choose between two men, William Kane and Tony. While William was fighting for control of the bank, I was building Baron into something much larger than the Richmond hotels had ever been. We were both becoming powerful. We were both building empires. and neither of us had forgotten the other. But the strange thing about our rivalry was this. I believed William Kane had taken something from me. I believed he had been the man who stood in my way when I needed help most. I had no idea that behind the scenes he had already done something that would change my life forever. And I had no idea that the man who had secretly given me my second chance was the very man I was preparing to destroy. By the beginning of 1934, Barron had become something much larger than the hotel I had once struggled to save. The money from the insurance company had given me the opportunity to expand, and I used every advantage I had. I opened more hotels, not only across America, but eventually overseas as well. For the first time in my life, I was no longer fighting simply to survive. I had built an empire. And yet, strangely, the more successful I became, the less satisfied I felt. I began thinking about Poland, country where I had been born, the country that had taken so much from me, the country I had never truly forgotten. I wanted to do something for it. So I entered politics. I believed that perhaps my success could be used for something beyond money. But while I was becoming more involved in politics, my marriage to Javier was beginning to change. When we first met, everything had seemed so simple. She had known me before I had become powerful, before Barron, before the hotels, before the money. But now I was changing. My ambitions were growing. I wanted more. Javier wanted something completely different. She wanted me to slow down. She wanted us to live a simpler life. She wanted me to hold an ordinary position and enjoy the family we had built together. But I could not. I had spent my entire life fighting my way upward. How could I suddenly stop? Then, in early 1934, Javier gave birth to a daughter. I named her Florentina. The name was not a coincidence. It was my way of remembering the sister I had lost so many years ago. The little girl became the center of my world. No matter how busy I became, no matter how many hotels I owned, no matter how much money I accumulated, Florentina was the one thing that made me feel truly rich. But my marriage continued to deteriorate. Eventually, I was unfaithful. Javier discovered it. And when she did, there was no dramatic confrontation. She simply understood that the man she had married was no longer the man standing in front of her. We divorced quietly. And after that, I poured all the love I had left into my daughter. Florentina became my reason to keep going, my reason to build, my reason to believe that perhaps my life could leave something behind beyond wealth and revenge. But while my personal life was falling apart, the world was moving toward another catastrophe. Europe was changing again. And in 1939, Hitler moved against Poland. The country of my birth was once again in danger. I watched from America as the place where my story had begun was being threatened all over again. I had escaped Poland once. I had survived one war. But now another war was coming. And this time, I was no longer a helpless boy hiding in a forest. I was Abel Rosnovski. I had money. I had influence. I had Barron, and I had something else now. A daughter named Florentina. Whatever happened next, I knew I could not simply stand and watch. But while I was looking toward Europe, William Kane was facing his own battle. His struggle was no longer simply about money. The banking world was changing. And soon, The war would force William and Tony to make a decision that would bring their two banks together. For years, William and I had been building our separate empires. Now, history was beginning to push us toward another confrontation. We had spent decades moving in parallel. Soon, our paths would cross again. And this time, the stakes would be much higher. By 1939, my life had become almost unrecognizable from the life I had once known. I had come to America with almost nothing. Now Barron had grown into a successful hotel company with properties in America and overseas. I had money. I had influence. And I had a daughter named Florentina, the name I had chosen to honor the sister I had lost so many years before. But then history began repeating itself. On May 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Poland, the country where I had been born, the country that had given me my earliest memories and taken away so many of the people I loved. Once again, Europe was moving toward war. This time, I was watching it from the other side of the Atlantic. I was no longer the helpless boy I had been during the First World War. I was Abel Rosnovski. I had built something of my own, and I had a daughter to protect. While Europe was being pulled into another war, William Kane was facing a different kind of problem. Tony had become increasingly worried about what would happen if Hitler managed to take London. London was not simply another city. It was one of the world's great financial centers. If London fell, the consequences could reach far beyond Europe. Tony believed the two banks needed to act. He proposed that Leicester Bank and Kane and Cabot should merge. Together, they would be stronger. Together, they could become a financial counterweight to Hitler. William agreed. On April 8, 1941, the merger was announced to the financial world. Two banks became one, Leicester Bank. And because William held the largest share of the new institution, he became its chairman. I was watching all of this from a different world. My attention was on Barron, on my family, on the future I was trying to build. But I had not forgotten William, and William had certainly not forgotten me. The war eventually ended. The world had changed again. And when peace returned after 1945, I looked at the new financial landscape and saw another opportunity. I had spent years building my own empire. Now I wanted a stake in his. Profits from Barron gave me the resources to begin buying shares in Leicester Bank. I managed to acquire 6%. I put the shares in Henry's name. But 6% was not enough. I wanted 2% more, because I had learned that if someone owned 8% of Leicester Bank, that person could gain real power within the bank. 8%. That was all I needed. 2 more percent. And then I would have a way into William Kane's world. I had spent decades building hotels. Now I was preparing to enter banking. And this time, I would not be approaching William as a man asking for help. I would be approaching him as a shareholder, as a rival, as a man who had finally acquired enough power to challenge him on his own ground. After everything that had happened between us, I still believed I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted to defeat William Kane. I did not yet understand how far that desire would take me. After the war, Barron continued to grow. Profits from the company gave me something I had never had before, enough power to enter William Kane's world. Banking. I began buying shares in Leicester Bank. Eventually, I acquired 6%. I placed the shares in Henry's name, but 6% was not enough. I needed 8, because I knew that under the bank's rules, anyone who controlled 8% of the shares would be given real influence within the bank. 2 more percent. That was all I needed. At the beginning of 1951, Leicester Bank was asked to represent a new American airline company. The airline needed $30 million in capital. William studied the project carefully. He decided to support it. Then he did something that made the investment even more important. He put his own money into the company. He encouraged others to invest alongside him. The offering was a success. People trusted William. They trusted Leicester Bank. And they trusted the future of the new airline. But there was something William did not know. I had already acquired 10% of the airline. 10%. That meant I had the power to threaten everything he had built. If I withdrew my investment, the public could lose confidence. The airline could collapse. And if that happened, Leicester Bank would suffer with it. William understood the danger. He believed I was trying to gain control of the company. He was right. But control was not what I wanted. Not yet. What I wanted was William. I wanted him to feel the same fear and uncertainty that I had felt years earlier when he had sat behind his desk and told me that my hotels could be taken away. For 20 years we had barely spoken. Now, for the first time in 2 decades, William Kane picked up the telephone and called me. He wanted to know what I was planning. I knew exactly what I was planning. I wanted revenge. The opportunity came in 1952. A passenger aircraft belonging to the airline crashed shortly after taking off from Mexico City. The entire crew and 17 passengers were killed. The newspapers immediately turned their attention to the airline. The public demanded an investigation. And Leicester Bank was suddenly under enormous pressure. I saw my opportunity. I released $1 million worth of the airline's shares onto the market. The next day, I released another $1 million. The share price collapsed. What had once been worth $4.50 a share was suddenly trading for only a few cents. The damage was enormous. William's reputation was at risk. Leicester Bank was being blamed for its involvement. And I had finally found a way to hurt him. But I did not care about the money. I could have made an enormous profit from the collapse. That was not the point. I wanted to destroy William Kane's reputation. I wanted him to feel powerless. I wanted him to understand what it was like to watch everything you had built begin to disappear. Then, as the price reached its lowest point, I bought the shares back. I made a fortune. But again, the money meant almost nothing to me. My hatred had become more valuable than money. I could have repeated the same attack again and again. And perhaps I would have, if revenge had not made me careless. Because in my determination to destroy William, I had crossed a line. I had manipulated the market. I had sold when the price was high and bought when it collapsed. William saw the opportunity. He filed a lawsuit against me. For the first time, I realized that my hatred had given him a weapon. And this time, I was the one who was in danger. I was over 50 years old. I had spent decades building Barron. I had a daughter. I had a reputation. And now I could lose everything. But I still had one thing William had underestimated. I had survived worse things than a courtroom, and I was not finished with him yet. By the time I reached my 50s, I had already spent more than half my life fighting William Kane. I thought I knew how our story would end. One of us would eventually win. The other would lose. And I was determined that it would be William. After the lawsuit over the stock market manipulation, I knew that I could no longer attack Leicester Bank in the same way. So I changed my strategy. I bought the additional 2% of Leicester Bank. 6% had not been enough. 8% was. With 8%, I could finally exercise real influence inside the bank. And I had only one goal. I wanted William Kane removed. Not only did I want him to resign, I wanted to make sure that no one carrying the Kane name could sit on the board for the next 10 years. I wanted to erase his legacy. After all those years, I finally succeeded. William lost the battle. He had spent more than half his life building his position at the bank. And now, because of me, he was forced out. I should have been satisfied. I had won. But victory did not feel the way I had imagined. William was getting old. All he wanted now was to see his son, Richard, his daughter-in-law, and his grandchildren. And while William was thinking about his family, I was beginning to realize that I had spent too much of my own life thinking about revenge. Then, in 1955, my daughter Florentina turned 21. She had just graduated. I wanted her to come back and become vice president of Barron. I wanted her to eventually take over everything I had built. But Florentina refused. She told me she needed experience first. She did not want to become the head of her father's company simply because she was my daughter. She wanted to prove herself. So she hid her identity and took a job as a saleswoman in a New York fashion store. I respected her decision, even though, as a father, part of me wanted to protect her and give her everything immediately. I did not know that her decision would bring our two families together in a way I could never have imagined. Because at the same time, William's eldest son, Richard, was also in New York. He was studying at Harvard Business School. During his vacation, he visited the same fashion store where Florentina worked. And he noticed her. He was attracted to her immediately. Richard invited her to dinner. They talked. They discovered that they had similar interests, similar personalities, and similar ways of thinking. They fell in love. But Richard did not know who she really was. Florentina had told him that she was simply a saleswoman from a poor family. For 3 months, she kept the truth from him. Then she could no longer bear the deception. She finally told Richard who she really was. The daughter of Abel Rosnovski, owner of Barron. Richard understood immediately what that meant. His father hated me, and I hated his father. How could the children of two men who had spent decades fighting each other ever be allowed to marry? Richard and Florentina still hoped that we might change. They went to speak to us. They told us that they wanted to get married. I listened, and then I gave them my answer. No. William gave Richard the same answer. Neither of us would accept the marriage. We were willing to cut our children off from our money and inheritance rather than allow them to marry each other. And that was when I realized something terrible. I had spent my entire life fighting William Kane. And now, our children were paying the price for a war they had never started. I had spent more than half my life fighting William Kane. I had defeated him. I had forced him out of the bank. And yet, when my daughter came to me and told me that she wanted to marry Richard Kane, I suddenly realized that winning the war had not brought me peace. Richard was William's son. Florentina was my daughter. Two of them had fallen in love without understanding the history between their fathers. When Florentina finally told Richard who she really was, he understood immediately what their relationship meant. His father hated me, and I hated his father. Still, they believed they could change us. They came to speak with me. Florentina stood before me and told me that she loved Richard. She wanted to marry him. I listened to my daughter, but all I could think about was William Kane. I could not forget the years of fighting. I could not forget the hotel, the bank, the humiliation, the revenge, and I refused. William did exactly the same. He refused to allow Richard to marry my daughter. He was prepared to cut Richard out of his inheritance. I was prepared to do the same to Florentina. Neither of us was willing to give up. So our children made the only choice they believed was left. They decided to leave. They ran away together to San Francisco. When Florentina disappeared, something inside me changed. For the first time in decades, I was no longer thinking about defeating William. I was thinking about losing my daughter. I wanted to find her. I wanted to speak to her. I wanted to convince her to leave Richard. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was behaving exactly like William. Two old men, two fathers, two enemies, and two children who were suffering because of a war they had never chosen. I tried to contact William. I wanted to meet him. Perhaps for once we could put our hatred aside and talk about our children. But William refused. He told me that the only place we would meet was in heaven. His words stayed with me, because suddenly I understood how much time we had wasted. We had spent our entire lives fighting, and now our children were trying to build the life that we had denied ourselves. I sent people to search for Florentina. Eventually, I discovered that she was trying to raise money to open a store. Richard was working at a bank. They were not asking us for our money. They were trying to build a life of their own. And perhaps that was what frightened me most. They did not need our empires. They did not need our names. They only needed each other. For the first time, I began to wonder whether the war between William and me had ever really been worth it. I had spent decades trying to destroy a man. And now I was watching the next generation try to escape the destruction we had created. But I was still not ready to admit that I had been wrong. Not yet. For years, I had believed that William Kane was the man who had stood in my way. I believed he had been my enemy from the beginning. But by the time I reached old age, I had already achieved what I once thought would make me happy. I had defeated him. William had been forced out of the bank. The battle I had spent so many years fighting was finally over. And yet I felt strangely empty. I no longer cared as much about the profits of Baron. I had built hotels across America and beyond. I had accumulated more wealth than I had ever imagined as that poor boy in Poland. There was one thing money could not give me: my daughter. I wanted to see Florentina again. I wanted to know how she was living, but I still could not bring myself to accept Richard. Then, in May 1967, Florentina and Richard opened their 11th store in New York. The opening attracted people from all over the city. Everyone wanted to be there. Everyone except two men, William Kane and me. We stood outside, watching the crowds enter. Neither of us went inside. We simply stood there, two old men who had spent most of their lives fighting each other. Then, for perhaps the first time in decades, William and I walked past each other. We stopped. We looked at one another, and neither of us said a word. We simply raised our hats and nodded. That was our farewell. There was no victory, no defeat, no argument. Just two old men acknowledging everything that had happened between them. Richard had promised his father that he would bring his wife and children to see him, and he kept his promise. But William would never see them. That night, before he could meet his daughter-in-law and grandchildren, William Kane died. I thought the story was over. Then, at his funeral, I received a letter. The letter came from a banker who had worked with both William and me. And what I read inside changed everything I thought I knew. In 1931, when I was desperately trying to save Richmond, the mysterious investor who had given me $2 million was William Kane. William had been the man behind the investment all along. He had secretly paid my debt. He had given me the opportunity to buy Richmond. And he had asked for only one thing, that I never discover his identity. He had not done it because he wanted recognition. He had done it as a personal investment. And I had spent decades hating the very man who had once given me the chance to rebuild my life. I read the letter again and again. Suddenly, memories came rushing back. The $2 million. The anonymous investor. The chance to save Richmond. The man I had blamed for taking everything from me. William, my greatest enemy, my greatest rival, and perhaps the man I had owed the most. For the first time, I understood that I had spent half my life fighting a man who had secretly helped me become the person I was. I went to find Florentina and Richard. I had one thing left to do: admit that I had been wrong. I apologized. And finally, I gave them what I had spent my entire life building. A baron, the company, the wealth, the future, all of it. It belonged to Florentina and Richard now. I had spent my life believing that winning meant defeating William Kane. But standing there, looking at my daughter, I finally understood. I had not won. Neither had William. We had simply spent our lives fighting while the people we loved were waiting for us to stop. And perhaps that was the real tragedy of our two lives. We were born on the same day. We grew up in completely different worlds. We built completely different empires. We became enemies. And in the end, we were not so different after all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories from great books, told from the perspective of the characters who lived them. And if this story made you curious about the full journey of Abel and William Kane, I highly recommend reading Kane and Abel yourself. The story in this video is only a condensed retelling. The book goes much deeper into their lives, their choices, their relationships, and the events that shaped them. If you want to read the full story, you can find the book through the link in the description. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.